1 year after my dad left, my mom got engaged to a man who didn't want me to move with them, and now she expects me to give up my inheritance for him. My name is Emily and I am 22 years old. A year ago, my father walked out on our family without warning, leaving my mom and me to pick up the pieces. It was tough, but we managed. Or at least I thought we did. A few months ago, my mom got engaged to a man named Greg and things quickly changed. Greg didn't want me to move with them when they relocated for his job. He made it clear he saw me as a complication, not a part of his new life. But the real shock came when my mom asked me to give up my inheritance for him. And that's when I realized how deep the problem really ran. When my dad left, I thought it was the end of the world. 21, I had barely started to figure out who I was, let alone how to cope with a situation like this. My dad had always been the solid, reliable figure in our family. He was the provider, the protector, and the one who ensured that everything at home ran smoothly. So when he packed his bags and walked out one day without so much as a goodbye, it felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me. The man I had trusted and admired for so long was gone, leaving only a hollow space in my life. It wasn't just the loss of my dad, it was the shock of it all. He had always been the rock, the steady one, and I had never imagined that one day, without any warning, he would just leave. My mother was shattered. I could see it in her eyes, in her every movement. For months, it felt like we were both drowning in an ocean of grief and confusion, struggling to find a way to stay afloat. There were nights when she cried, nights when she told me she didn't know what to do, and I tried my best to be there for her. But despite everything, I couldn't stop feeling like I had just lost my own foundation too. For months, I tried to take on the responsibility of being both the daughter and the caretaker. I picked up a part-time job to help with the bills, knowing my mom couldn't manage alone. But there was only so much I could do. I was still figuring out my own life, balancing school with the need to work, and the pressure to be strong for her felt like an unbearable weight on my shoulders. Even though I had grown up fast, I wasn't prepared to lose my dad, nor was I ready for what life would throw at me in the months to come. Then came Greg. Mom met Greg a few months after Dad left. First, he seemed like a lifeline, a distraction for her, maybe someone to give her hope again. Greg was charming, attentive, and treated her with kindness in ways that made me believe he was good for her. But as time went on, I started to get a sinking feeling in my stomach every time he was around. There was something about him that made me feel uneasy. He wasn't the type of man I'd ever imagined for my mom, and his control over her started to show in subtle ways. He would make little comments about how she should spend her money, how she should think about her future, and it felt like his presence in our home was becoming more about his own needs than hers. But the real tension began when they got engaged. I remember the day Mom announced it, it was as if everything changed. She was so excited, but I felt like I was being shoved aside. Greg was already asking me when I planned to move out. He was eager for Mom and me to separate, for me to be independent. His words felt like a dismissal of everything I had been through, like our family no longer mattered. It wasn't just about me being independent, it was about him creating the family he wanted without me in it. I was left with the uncomfortable truth that I was not part of their future plans. Then came the real shock. When Mom and Greg decided to move to his city, they made it clear that I wasn't invited. It wasn't a discussion, it was a decision. Greg didn't want me living with them. Mom said it was time for me to start my own life, but there was a coldness in her voice that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just a suggestion, it felt like an ultimatum. And despite my attempts to reason with her to explain how hurtful it was, she sided with him. She brushed off my feelings, telling me that I needed to be independent and that I shouldn't expect to be a part of their new life together. And then the bombshell came. One day, while they were discussing their future plans, Mom casually told me that I needed to give up my inheritance for Greg. She explained that Greg wanted a larger share of her estate, and she was willing to make that happen if it meant he would feel more comfortable. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. She was asking me, her daughter, to give up my future for the man she had only recently married, a man who had always treated me like an outsider. The woman I had thought was my biggest supporter, my mother, the person who had always stood by me, was now willing to sacrifice me for him. Felt like everything had come full circle, and it wasn't the way I had hoped. What was supposed to be a time of healing after my dad's departure had turned into a nightmare. I had already lost my father. Now I was losing my mother too. And she wasn't just abandoning me emotionally, she was asking me to give up my inheritance, my future, just to satisfy the man who seemed to have little regard for me at all. I spent several days grappling with the weight of my mother's request. I felt like I had been blindsided and taken advantage of, but I was still hoping there had been some kind of misunderstanding. My head was spinning, and I had no idea how to process what was happening. My entire life, my family had been about unconditional love and support. Now it felt like everything I had known was unraveling. I had to find a way to get through to my mom. Maybe she was just caught up in the excitement of her new life. I decided to confront her, to have a serious conversation about the inheritance and how unfair this situation was. So, I arranged to meet her at the cafe where we used to go when I was younger, hoping that the familiar setting would give us some clarity. When we sat down, I could see that she was more relaxed, and Greg was nowhere to be seen. I tried to approach the conversation with patience, carefully explaining how I felt, how I had been there for her during Dad's departure, and how this sudden change in her behavior was deeply hurtful. But her response hit me like a cold wave. She told me, almost matter-of-factly, that I needed to stop being selfish. She said that my father wasn't coming back and that I needed to accept the reality of their new life together. As for the inheritance, she justified it by saying that Greg was her future and that she wanted him to feel secure. In that moment, it was clear that she had chosen him over me, and no amount of talking was going to change her mind. That's when the truth really began to hit home. It wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about how my mother had emotionally disconnected from me and was prioritizing a man she had known for only a short time over her own daughter. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my mother had likely been manipulated by Greg. It wasn't just the inheritance. He had somehow managed to isolate her from me, pushing her to choose him over her own child. It was like the rug had been pulled from under me a second time. After that conversation, things between me and my mother became even more strained. I stopped visiting her home and started distancing myself, though it hurt more than I had imagined. I had always been close to my mother, and now I was faced with the painful truth that the person who had raised me seemed willing to throw everything away for a man who didn't even seem to care about me. Then, one day, I received an unexpected message from Greg. It was a text asking if I could meet him to talk about the inheritance. Something about the message felt off. It wasn't just about the money. It felt like he was pushing me to do what he wanted, yet again. He had always found a way to manipulate situations to his advantage, and I knew this was no different. But this time, I wasn't going to back down. I decided to take control of the situation. This was no longer just about my inheritance. It was about taking back my power and standing up for myself. I needed to stop letting Greg dictate my life and ensure that my voice was heard. I had to decide what was more important, my relationship with my mom or my own dignity. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone pressure me into sacrificing myself for the sake of others. I wasn't sure what I expected when I met Greg. Maybe I thought he would at least try to make a case for why he was asking me to give up my inheritance. But the moment I saw him sitting across from me in that restaurant, all his charm seemed fake. His words were smooth, but his intentions were clear. He wanted what he had been scheming for all along, and that was to control my mother and take as much from her as possible. First, he tried to act all reasonable, telling me that if I just gave up my share of the inheritance, it would show that I was supportive of my mom's new life. He said it was a gesture that would prove I was mature and that I was accepting of their marriage. In my mind, I could already hear the underlying message: give up your future so we can secure ours. He couldn't have been more transparent. But I wasn't backing down. I told him that this wasn't about being mature. This was about a lifetime of loyalty and trust that had been shattered by his manipulation. I told him that if he truly loved my mother, he would not try to tear apart the only thing that had kept me grounded during the hardest time of my life, my relationship with her. I was shaking with anger, but I refused to let it control me. His condescending tone was so infuriating that I could feel my blood boiling, but I stayed calm. That's when he started twisting everything around, making it seem like my refusal was some personal vendetta against him or their marriage. He claimed that I was jealous of their happiness and that my refusal was the reason my mother couldn't fully move on. It was an attack on my character, and I felt the sting of it, but I couldn't let him win. That's when he really dropped the mask. His tone changed, and I saw a glimpse of the real Greg. He was aggressive, almost defensive, as if he had been expecting some kind of confrontation. He told me that I was being selfish, and that my mother was finally happy. He told me that I was holding her back from living a fulfilling life with him, and that I needed to learn to let go. But it wasn't just the words, it was the way he spoke about my mother. He had no respect for her. He only saw her as a means to an end, a way to secure his own position. I could see how he had wrapped her around his finger, using her vulnerabilities against her to control the situation. Greg's manipulation tactics were more than just verbal attacks. They were subtle, calculated moves to ensure he would never have to worry about money. He knew my mother's weakness, her guilt, and he knew how to use it to get what he wanted. His plan was simple: separate me from my inheritance so he could get access to her finances without anyone questioning his intentions. And then came the final blow. He told me that if I didn't give up the inheritance, I would never see my mother again. He made it clear that he would make sure my mom would cut ties with me if I refused. He said that he had already discussed it with her, and that it was only a matter of time before she would side with him completely. It was then that I realized just how deep his control over her had gone. He was using my inheritance as leverage to force my mom into choosing him, and he was willing to break the last bond between us to do it. This wasn't about love, it was about power. He wasn't trying to build a future with her. He was trying to control everything about her life. And he thought I was naive enough to fall for it. I sat there, stunned by the audacity of it all. I couldn't believe that a man who had barely been in our lives for a year could already have so much influence over her, and yet here he was, trying to take everything from me. I knew what was at stake, and it wasn't just an inheritance anymore. It was my future, my autonomy, and my relationship with the only parent I had left. But I wasn't going to let him have the last word. With every ounce of strength I had, I stood up, told him he could take his manipulations elsewhere, and walked out of that restaurant. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that I had finally said no, but anger that it had come to this. It was clear now that Greg wasn't the man my mother thought he was. He was a stranger, and not just to me. He was a stranger to everything my mom had worked for, everything she had valued. That was the moment I made my decision. I was done playing by his rules. I was no longer just defending an inheritance. I was defending my dignity, my future, and the bond that should have never been broken. I would fight for what was rightfully mine, and I would help my mother see what was really going on, even if it meant destroying the facade she had been so willing to accept. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how my mom would react when I told her everything. But I knew I couldn't let Greg win. I had to protect myself, and I had to find a way to help my mother see the truth. I wasn't giving up without a fight. If you enjoyed this story, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.